This week's Torah portion is called Tetzave. And I think the thread that runs through this Torah portion is what's hidden and what's revealed. So the first thing we read about in this week's Torah portion, after last week where we read about the vessels that would be constructed, that would be put inside the Mishkan, inside the tabernacle that the Jewish people traveled with when they were in the desert. They'd come out of Egypt, they come through the Red Sea, they're building this Mishkan, this tabernacle that God's presence is going to rest upon. And last week we read about the vessels that are going to be in there, and the menorah was one of them. And this week we read about the oil that's going to go into that menorah, that's going to light it, that's going to bring the flame out into the world. And we also read about the clothing of the priestly tribe. Aaron, the brother of Moses, is going to be inaugurated as the high priest. He's going to be the one to do the service in the temple, and his sons and his descendants for all time, even till today, are part of that priestly nation. Those priests in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and then later in the temple, had special clothing that they wore. The regular Kohen, the regular priest, had 4 articles of clothing. He had a turban, he had a tunic, he had a pants, and he had a sash. He had 4 garments that were made out of white. They were white linen, and they were what they wore. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had 4 extra garments that he would wear, and they were a breastplate, which is an amazing thing. He had an apron and a breastplate, and on the breastplate were jewels, little squares that were representative of each of the tribes of Israel, and he also had a headband, an extra headband, and he had a robe. He had a blue robe. And the priest, the high priest, with all these colors, it was blue and it was gold, and it was like an amazing spectacle, I imagine, to see the Kohen Gadol with all his colors and all his finery. And the point is that the garments were to elevate God. They weren't to elevate him. They were to elevate God. He was wearing these garments in the service of God. And so when the people would look at him, and they would be in awe of this service, and they would be in awe of God, and they would see the beauty that it would inspire them. The blue robe, blue was made out of techeles, which was a special kind of blue ink that came from a little snail, and that blue was the blue of the sea. And they would look at the blue, and they would think of the sea, and then they would look up into the sky, and they would look up to the higher realms where God sits on his heavenly throne, so to speak, with this blue sapphire that we wrote about before, the sapphire brick under his heavenly throne. That the blue would orient people to look up, to look towards God, to understand that there's God in the world and there's transcendence in the world. That's why it was blue. There's so many things about this beautiful robe that I actually want to harp on. The other thing about this was that at the very bottom, around the bottom of the hem, there were little bells that were interspersed with cloth pomegranates. So there was a bell and a pomegranate, And so the bell would ring. So when the Kohen Gadol when the high priest would be walking along, you would hear him coming. And actually from this, we learn about knocking on a door. Before you go into a room, even if it's your own house, you should knock on the door. You shouldn't just walk into a room. You should knock on the door, just like the high priest in the temple. When he would walk, you would know he was coming. You don't surprise someone. You don't just walk in. You always knock on the door before you go in. So there was a bell and there were pomegranates, and the pomegranates were silent. And perhaps we can learn here also the exchange between making noise and being quiet. Sometimes we make noise and sometimes we make quiet, but maybe we have to make twice as much quiet as we make noise, so that there's 2 pomegranates for each bell. Something to think about. But the hem around the neck was a double hem to maybe indicate, like our mouths with our lips. It was all the male, this robe that the high priest wore was to atone for the sins of evil speech, of gossip, of slandering with our speech. And this robe atoned for those. So too, when we get buried today, in our days, we get buried in white garments that resemble the garments of the Kohen, of the priest. We get buried in pants and a robe and a headdress and a sash. And these things, each one of those atone for particular sins of the person. And when we wash someone and we get them ready for burial, we put them through a mikveh, just like the Kohen went through a mikveh, went through the waters, these purifying waters that would ritually purify them. We do that with our deceased, and we dress them in these garments. And as we dress them, we pray for them that they should be atoned for any sins that they did in their lives, any sins from their mouths, any sins from sexuality or from money or whatever it is. And the garments atoned. The garments add to the capacity we have to atone for those sins. So when we talk about garments, what are we wearing garments for? We're wearing garments to cover ourselves up. Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, and when they ate from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, their soul became secondary to their bodies. Their bodies became more constant, more thick, so to speak, like a hide. We call our skin our hide, because the soul went inside. It became hidden. Our souls are hidden. And I think this talk is about the juxtaposition of hiding and revealing. So the soul goes in and our bodies become what we see when we look at each other. And God clothed Adam and Eve. They were embarrassed, and God clothed them. And it's for us to be godlike, we have to clothe. We have to clothe ourselves. We have to clothe each other, and we wear clothes. But what do clothes do? Clothes make the man. Clothes, sometimes they reveal who we are. For the high priest in the temple, he's doing the service of God, and he represents, so to speak, God. And people look at him and they're inspired, and they want to atone for the things they do wrong, and they want to come close to God. And the clothing of the high priest, the clothing of the priestly nation, direct us to want to honoring God. It says that the Kohen Gadol, that his clothes were for honor and for splendor, meaning that there's something really beautiful about beautifying our observance, about wearing beautiful clothes, about having a beautiful Kiddush cup, about having a beautiful challah board, about having a beautiful mezuzah on our wall, whatever it is on our doors, whatever we have a way to beautify it, to make it even more special, because we're elevating the physical into something very beautiful, and it inspires us to get closer to God. So that's one reason why we want to make things beautiful. We want things to be beautiful. We don't want them to hide. We want them to hide, but we also want them to reveal. They want them to reveal who we are. Are we kind? Are we looking to get closer to God? Are we looking to get closer to each other? So our clothes, sometimes they hide who we are. We look back in the Torah and you see the story of Jacob, who deceived Esau and got the blessing from Isaac. He put on clothing to make his father believe that he was somebody else, that he was his brother. That's in the beginning where we learned about Jacob and Esau, where Jacob deceives his father to get the blessing. We learn about Joseph and his multicolored coat that the brothers bring to their father and say, he was killed by an animal, which he wasn't, but they deceived their father using a garment. And we have Joseph in the palace of Pharaoh wearing the viceroy clothing, and the brothers come to get food, and they see and they meet with Joseph, but they don't recognize him because he's wearing clothes of the Egyptian viceroy. They don't recognize him because he's costumed. God hides in our world. God is not so obvious to us. Esther, when we come to the story of Purim, Esther hides in the palace. Ahasuerus doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know that she's a Jewess. She hides her identity. So there are times where we need to hide who we are, and there are times where we need to reveal who we are, like the Kohen, like the high priest in the temple. We need to know who you are and what you're doing and how you're coming close to God, because we want to do that too, and we want to be elevated by this practice, and we want to atone for the things that we do wrong, and we want to get closer. On the Sabbath, we wear special clothing. We don't wear the clothing that we wear during the week. We change and we put on clothing. Why? Because we want to elevate the day. The day becomes a special day because we do different things in that day. We wear special clothes. We might want to save our special jewelry for that day, or a special garment. Like I have particular shoes I like to wear on Shabbat. They're my Shabbat shoes, and I wear them on Shabbat, but they're special to me, and they make me feel like I'm doing something to elevate the day. The day becomes elevated by what I wear. So I think what this Torah portion is teaching us is this juxtaposition between hiding and revealing. When do we hide who we are, and when do we reveal who we are, and why do we do that? So there's an open-ended question. When we look back last week to the ark in the ark of the covenant in the tabernacle, which housed the 10 commandments, the tablets, and we spoke about that a little bit last week. But this Aaron, this ark, was gold on the outside and gold on the inside. There was wood in between, but there was gold on the outside, gold on the inside. This congruence of who we are on the outside. Are we gold on the outside? Are we gold on the inside? And now we go back to the olive oil that was crushed out of the oil out of the olive to get this one drop, this first drop that had no sediments in it, had no detritus in it. It was just pure oil that was crushed out of the olive. That pure oil was used in the menorah, and the oil was inside the olive, but it needed crushing. It needed some kind of pressure to take that oil out, and then we put the oil in the menorah and we light it, and it brings flame and light and goodness out into the world. And maybe that's what we have to do, that we all have also our inner oil. It says that the Hebrew word for oil is shemen, and the Hebrew word for name is shame, and the Hebrew word for our neshama is neshama. And so they're all linked together, that the inner essence of who we are is our neshama. The inner essence of who we are is good and holy and connected to God. And when we open that up and we reveal it, and like the olive reveals the oil and brings that oil out, it shines out into the world. So I think when we wrap this up and we think about this week's Torah portion, we think about the garments that the Kohen wore, that the priest wore, and we think about the garments that we wear, and whether we wear them to deceive who we are, or we use them to enhance who we are and to spread out goodness into the world. That they're clothing that represent specialness on Shabbat, perhaps, or on the holidays. That we beautify our synagogues, we beautify our Torah observance by the mezuzahs and the challah board and the whatever Judaica. There's so much beautiful Judaica, and it enhances our practice. It makes us feel very spiritual and very good. So I hope that as we enter into this holiday of Purim, that as we enter into this Parsha of Tetzave, that we find that right balance, the right balance of hiding and revealing and knowing who we are and shining out the goodness that's within each one of us.